For this project, we're going to be creating a digital landscaped painting. Now, like the still life project that we did, landscapes have a lot in common as far as composition techniques, but there's some differences and different way of thinking about this particular project. Also, our process of developing it may be a little bit different too. So I want to cover how to set up and think about a landscape value study first. Then we'll get into talking about some of the reference photos and how to pick a good reference photo and what to work with. So the first thing we're going to do, let's jump into Photoshop. We're going to make a new document. This document is going to be 3,000 pixels wide by 2,000 pixels tall. Keep that number in mind, 3 by 2. And we're going to, of course, keep our color mode RGB. We'll say OK to this, and this is the document that we have set up. The first thing I want you to do is to create a series of value studies in these compositions. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. Here's how we're going to box off the different areas. If you'll grab your rectangle marquee tool, make sure your feather is set to 0, and we're going to set the style of this rectangle marquee not to normal but to fixed ratio. Keeping it at a fixed ratio will allow us to make a selected area of a certain height and width. No matter what size we make it, it'll stay that ratio width. And the width is going to be 3 by 2. This is the same size as your document. So now when I click and drag, no matter where I move, the size of the box is staying at a fixed ratio of 3 by 2. And what I want to do is to make a series of boxed areas just with a simple outline around them. So to do this, I've got my area selected, hold down Control and click, choose Stroke, and we're going to give it a simple 5-point stroke with a dark color around it. When we say OK, this is what we've got. And just make several of these, doesn't matter the size. Keep them pretty small because we don't want these studies to be too detailed. Control, click, stroke, fill it in with 5 pixels. If you want, you can click in the center now, move it over, and then reapply the stroke again. 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels. That'll be enough for now to demonstrate what we're doing. Fill up your area, do a variety of color studies for your project. Let's start talking now a little bit about composition. Of course, when you talk about composition, what you're really talking about is where do you place things on your canvas. So we're going to use this and pretend this is our canvas type area. The first thing to think about when you make a landscape is where's your horizon line going to be? And the horizon is simply the where the sky meets the land or the sea if you're doing a sea type painting. Basic thing you can do is simply draw a line going straight across your area. The area up top would be your sky. Area down below is going to be your land or your sea. Now, as with the still life compositions we created, if you put your horizon right in the center of your painting, it's going to be kind of boring, kind of monotonous. And so a lot of landscape painters will tend to not do this. Instead, they use the good old rule of thirds. Pull your horizon line down a little bit or even up a little bit, and that'll give you a little bit more visual play between the two. Now, your horizon line doesn't always have to be straight across. This is also kind of tedious and boring. If you give your horizon a little bit of a rolling effect, now I've got hills that I can work with. And this gives a little bit more visual interest to the area that you're working on. Additionally, I can take this and start dividing it up and add more hills to it. So now I've got overlapping introduced to it. And I've also got this sense of depth to there. I've got kind of a foreground, a middle ground, and even a background. Pay attention to that because that's going to come into play a lot better too. The second thing you'll want to consider is, well, most landscapes are more than just land. They'll have other objects associated with it. I've gone ahead and pre-drawn some trees and some rocks. Let's throw these in here and see how they can be worked with. As with your still life composition, whenever you place something, you want to pay attention to your rule of thirds and also the size and the scale of your objects. If you've got something closer to you, obviously that object is going to be very big. It's going to be much larger in size and it has a lot more detail. Notice I place this on my rule of thirds, so that looks nice and grounded right there. If I made a copy of it, I can put another thing on the other side. It's nice and well balanced, but it just doesn't look very, very interesting. So now that I've got a landscape, I can start playing with perspective. And perspective, all that simply means is any object that goes away from you, recedes away from you, it gets closer to the horizon line, and it also gets smaller. And when we start talking about aerial perspective, it even gets a little bit lighter. So if I wanted a tree to be off in the distance, I would make it smaller, and I would make it closer to whatever the horizon line would be for here. Now I've got a composition that's starting to be a little bit more dynamic. I've got large areas. Let's throw in, I guess these are either rocks or some bushes. And I can place those on the foreground and the midground. I could have a variety of trees way off in the distance. Again, if they're farther away, I need to make them much, much smaller, and I can have a good variety to choose from. There we go. Just place those. Put that on there, place another one over here. Now I can build my composition just like that. Paying attention to the foreground, middle ground, and background is what really gives a landscape a good sense of depth. You can't pull that off too well with a still life, because so many still lifes are right there in front of you. There's not too much depth that you're dealing with. The second thing to consider when you're talking about depth is aerial perspective. You want your farthest things in the back to be slightly lighter, and also, if you're dealing with color, slightly bluer. So now we can start playing around with lights, midtones, and darks. Which area is going to be lightest, midtone, and dark type area? So if I do a value study, maybe my foreground, the things that are in front here, this big tree in this first part of land, that can be very, very dark. And my midground can be a mid-type range, a nice gray, and my background can be much lighter, a light white or a light blue. Now, you don't always have to stick with this. You'll start to see a lot of painters, sometimes they'll have a nice dark sky, and their lightest area may be a city in the midground, and something in the foreground will be just kind of a midtone, setting the stage with that. Or sometimes their foreground is very, very light. Their midground is dark, and their background is very, very light. When we look at the reference photos, start paying attention to what's lightest, mid-tones, and the darkest. We'll come back to here and start doing a value study based on that. So now let's look at some reference photos and talk about what makes a good reference photo and what doesn't make a good reference photo. So I went to the internet and I just started to do a simple search for different landscape paintings and also some landscape reference photos that you can work from. And I'll upload these to Moodle so you can see exactly what I'm seeing. But for here, let's look at some actual paintings and see how the artist uses foreground, middle ground, and background, and also how they use light, midtones, and darks within each of the areas. Keep in mind, some of these paintings, they're going to be digital paintings. There are even going to be some fantasy paintings from concept artists. But also, some of these paintings are going to be traditional paintings from the master workers that have done this hundreds of years ago. The concepts I'm telling you are still the same today. So check this one out. If I was to divide this up, obviously the background is this light sky with a little bit of clouds in there. My midground is these trees in the tree line. This is the darkest area. And then my foreground is this brushy grass area. And that's much, it's not light, it's not dark, it's a good midtone. Here's another one. It's a fantasy landscape. Do you see the foreground, middle ground, and background? In this case, the foreground, just this little area here, is nice and dark. Darkest part of the point. The lightest part is the very background, and even the midtone right here is in the midground. Now, to draw attention to the castle, they made that even lighter than the background, and you can play around with that. But in general, my midground, midtone. Same way from here. My background is nice and dark and stormy. My foreground, it's dark up here. It's got some highlights on the trees, but my midtones are nice and light. This is the lightest area from here. Same way with this one. Do you see the foreground? Foreground is the big trees. The midground are these bushes of trees, forest, and then the background, very, very light off in the back. This is just a quick compositional study, but do you see how they're using foreground, midground, background? Foreground is framed off by these two rocky areas. Midground is right here, and obviously there's a background back there. Here's another great fantasy landscape. Even though the composition is almost repeating itself over and over again, the foreground is kept very, very dark right here. The midground gets nice midtones, and as it gets further back, it gets very, very hazy, very light. This is that sense of aerial perspective. The air that's coming through there, you're having to see through all that mist, and so it's much difficult to see things that are farther away. Do you see the foreground? Foreground is this area down here, nice and dark. The midground right here is nice and light. The background, the sky, is the midtones that you can work from. See how things are layering over one another. When you look for your composition, play around with layering. You can change things up if you want to move things around, but having layering gives it that great sense of depth. Check out the foreground, nice and dark. Check out this midground. Midground is the lightest part of the area. In the background, this part's light and it's surrounded by a little bit darker type area. This is a work by the great English painter John Constable. He was a master at mastering those three different planes of working with. His backgrounds are constantly very, very light, very blue up in there. His midground, these trees, are very, very dark, and his foreground is our midtones from right here. The setting of the stage, the closest stuff, is in the middle ground. Here's another Constable. Do you see it? Do you see the foreground, middle ground, and background? I'm going to go quickly through the rest of these. Pay attention to color. Pay attention, most importantly, to value. That's why we're doing a value study first. If I was looking at some reference photos, now you can go out and take your own reference photos, or you can use some of the reference photos I've given you here. I'll give you fair warning. It's sometimes difficult to find the perfect picture. So instead, try to take several photographs and pull things from different photographs together. Maybe you like a good middle ground composition, or you found a great tree that you want to be in your foreground. Maybe you photographed some clouds that would make for a great background. You can do that. You can pull each thing together and use multiple references. But also pay attention that your compositions have that clear sense of depth to them. And this is what I mean for aerial perspective. See, this is a photograph. Check out the distance. It's not just lighter, it's bluer. That's because the air that's coming through there has a bluish tinge to it. That's why the sky is blue. Here's another one. Great sense of foreground. Very, very light area. My sky is a midtone. My background, my middle ground is the darkest area with that one. Pay attention to skies. Skies can be very, very dramatic. In this case, there's not too much of a middle ground, but I've got a great sense of space that's incorporated. There's another great sky. They don't always have to be blue. Wake up early in the morning. Clouds have great shapes to them. You can't go wrong when painting a cloud. There's that sense of perspective. Off in the background is nice and blue. Great sky. Here's another great thing to look at. Roads will give your eye a sense of direction. It'll lead your eye through different things. Things that are rolling hills. I love Scotland because of the hill type country that they have. This again has great foreground, middle ground, background composition. Pay attention that the edges in nature are very rarely straight. Oftentimes things are just overlapping each other and have nice dynamic areas. If you're going to take a picture like this, in this case there's not too much of a background. In this case not too much background of the sky. In this case the foreground is the leaf trail that's here. The midground are these trees and the background becomes the forest. Here's another great one that's going to lead your eye. You've got a road here, you've got a hazy background and a dark kind of midground. Trees are framing off this one, dark foreground. Again, dark foreground, good midground, good background. Great sense of color, great sense of value is the main thing. I can tell that these trees are in the distance because they're lighter, they're bluer. I can tell these trees are in the midground because they're darker. And the things that are in front of here are midtones. I also want to show you some bad examples, things to kind of be aware of and stay away from. I know this one's kind of small. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Never take a photograph like this. It's boring, it's monotonous, there's no sense of foreground, middle ground, or background. Hey, it's a great picture, there's lots of color in it, and maybe you can do something pattern-wise, but for a landscape, I need to have a better sense of depth. Same way for this type of photograph. There's not a clear sense of depth. I definitely have, a long way to go. I've got a sky and I've got a horizon, but what's in my foreground? I've got these rocks, and I've got maybe this pond in the midground, but I don't really have a lot to distinguish between the two. So if I was to do this as a painting, I would really want to play up these rocks, maybe adding some bigger boulders on top of these rocks to give me a better sense of a foreground. Maybe playing up the sky, giving the sky more texture to play up the sense of a background. You can still use it as a reference photo, you just got to work with it a little more. Here's another one you would have to work with a little bit more too. In this case, it definitely has a good sense of foreground, middle ground, and background, but check out this tree. The value of this tree is the same as the value in these background trees. So if I was to paint this, if the tree is going to be part of my foreground, then the foreground needs to have a better value. It needs to be either lighter or darker than the midtones in the background. So maybe I would do my sky nice and light. I would do my midground in a dark color. I would do my foreground in a midtone area. You can play around with this. The midtones don't always have to be in the middle. You can put midtones in the sky, put dark in the sky, and play around with the composition of this. Love those little cows off to the side. You could take references like this, place them in another photograph, and work with those. Okay, so now let's jump back into our value scale and start talking about how we can play around with what's going to be light, medium, and dark. So to start our value study, what I've done is I've drawn off a simple composition based on one of the reference photos that I like to work with. So in this case, I'm going to use this one. And when I say keep it simple, I mean don't try to add every little detail right now. For now, we're just going to play around with the lights, mediums, and darks of each of the planes. Now, if I'm looking at my reference photo, if I was to choose my fill bucket and pick a dark color, I can pick it and say my photo itself, the foreground is nice and dark. My midtones, so if I got a midtone, I can fill those in with a lighter area, and then my background is pretty light in itself. So there's my composition technique as far as foreground, middle ground, and background. And it does a pretty good job of giving me a sense of depth. But let's play around with it. Let's see what else we can do. I've drawn off some more compositions. And again, these aren't perfect, but all I'm going to do now is play around with that sense of foreground, middle ground, background. What if I made my midground, this area, darkest? What if I made my foreground, pick up that color, lightest or midtone, and then my background, something like that? How does that change it up? Hey, what would happen if I made this foreground area even lighter? Or what if I made my background really dark? So in this case, something like that. And then maybe my midground or foreground would be that color, and then my midground would be lightest. Now I've got 3 different compositions that I can start to play with. Play around with the values. You don't have to keep everything exactly as I see with my photograph. Actually, I kind of like the looks of this second one. Even this third one adds an interesting, real dynamic to there. I could see some dark clouds in the sky up there. I can see some really light hills in the background. So from here, once you pick a composition, let's say I like this one on top, grab your brush, then go back in and start adding details. Now, just because I've got the midground being very light or the background being very, very dark, doesn't mean that I have to stay within that. Now I can start to push and pull the area, but all I'm doing is making a value study for what I'm trying to work with. So if I was to do these trees, I wouldn't choose a straight black dark and start painting a dark tree on top of there. Remember, I want to stay in my mid-tone range, but I would make them a little bit darker than this foreground area. Let's get it even a little bit darker from there. There we go. So now I've got my trees that I can work with, kind of blocking in the area. And if I see that, hey, this doesn't work out, we can move around with that. For my background, maybe I'll add a few small details. Remember, the farther it gets away, the smaller the details are, so you want those brush strokes to be nice and small. I can see even in my foreground I need to make this a little bit darker. Now I'm just playing around with how the lights and the shadows stay on each other. Also, I recommend working in a bigger brush just so you can work quickly, play around with where those light areas are. Let's grab some mid-tone. And I'm painting on top of it. I'm not even worrying about dropping my opacity or changing my opacity up. I'm just paying attention to where things are at. It's starting to come together. I get a sense of trees and a tree line, maybe even making this a little bit darker to work with. And so now my tree composition is starting to work out. Let's pull out some highlights for right there. This is what I mean for a value study. Give yourself an idea of what the values can be. If this is your first time doing a landscape composition, try to copy the picture exactly as you see it. But if you've had some experience doing landscapes, if you've had some experience doing painting, try to play up the colors. Try to see the different values within the color references that you're working with. Don't feel like you always have to stay exactly the same. What we're doing here is we're playing around. Now I've got a sense of lights, mediums, and darks pushing and pulling through. Maybe even that mid-ground needs to be a little bit darker. There we go. Now I can really distinguish that background from my mid-tone. Okay, so the next part, once we get a good value study done, and I want you to do several of them, play around with it. Again, don't keep them very, very detailed. Keep them rough. From here, we can take this into our final composition and actually play around with the textures of the brush and play around with how things on your final composition should look. All right, I'm having too much fun. Let's get into the actual project.